Now, a few distinctions about the bridge arm. If I look at the structure of the neck, we have in the center the trachea, which as we all know is extremely fragile. And then on the side of the trachea, on either side, we have these two large cable-like muscles, which are the sternocleidomastoids. In between the sides of the middle height of the trachea and the sternocleidomastoids, we have these two little pits, and those are known as the carotid sinus. So we have a neurological affectation that can happen from hitting the carotid sinus. We have respiration that can be affected and possibly lethally in hitting the trachea. We have structural affectation, flexion of the head if we hit the muscle and some level of nerve. And then underneath here as well, we start to get into the carotid arteries and the vagus nerve. And those can have huge affectations at minimum on your balance, at maximum on your neurological system and circulatory system, causing a temporary, brief, but violent knockout, usually known as a brachial stun, because this entire junction here is known as the brachial plexus. Now, if you look at a lot of traditional martial arts, you'll see these dim-mak knockouts, which, for the record, are extremely irresponsible. Generally, they will be performed towards these front angles, with emphasis being placed on pushing towards the carotid sinus. In Asian acupressure, it's normally known as stomach 9. And stomach 9, this pressure point is a huge knockout point. Very, very dangerous, but it's also very irresponsible because in affecting these and hitting these, you can cause long-term damage. When you hit it, you get a neurological overload where people will flinch up very tightly, and what can happen is that when you fall in a rigid state, your head can get smashed on the floor. Moreover, when you get hit during that moment of impact, the vertebrae can get massively damaged, and there's some evidence to suggest that you can cause kinking and bruising to the arteries that facilitate the collection of cholesterol and plaque and then lead to blockages down the road. So there's all sorts of arguments not to be made for it, or to be made against it. You can look into medical journals, you'll see that in Quebec actually we have, I believe, the only recorded example of somebody dying from a kiss to the carotid sinus because they were sleeping in a state of tension, hypertension presumably, and when the wife kissed the individual on the neck, the person went into cardiac arrest. If you go on YouTube and you look up, I believe it's brachial stun or vagus nerve, there's even a clip where a doctor is assessing this, but you see a group of people tickling a friend as a joke, and the guy's in a state of like complete contraction, but one of the people is tickling his carotid sinuses, and he literally, because of the vagus nerve, goes into a state of unconsciousness. So very, very dangerous. It used to be the domain of chi masters and fly-by-night sort of blast energy martial arts culty schools where people would smash each other in the carotid sinuses. I certainly was taught this way. I was guilty of doing this in my early years of teaching. And when you're young and don't know better and you have it done to you 100 times, you go, wow, that's amazing. Then you mature and you realize it's not that responsible and extremely dangerous. And then you start to become aware of how many people are getting injured from it and the long-term effects. What's significantly more troubling to me now is that now I've seen that type of martial voodoo creeping into defensive tactics. And you'll see defensive tactics instructors teaching it. Sometimes they'll have a guy evangelically standing behind the person to catch them. Other times they'll put a crash mat. Sometimes they'll say, well, for your safety, I'll have you sit as I smash you in the side of the neck. Again, there is enough evidence, because of these people filming it, of what the strike can do. There is enough evidence in the real world that these strikes can cause unconsciousness. We do not ever need to train impact to this area. Possibly the most intelligent hitting or hands-on way that you can teach it is to take your arm. And if you compare the solidity and the strength of a humerus, upper bone in your upper arm, to the fragility of the vertebrae in the cervical arch, there's no comparison. Humerus is one solid mass. If I take an impact to the side of it, it can break if it's significant, but a slight impact to the side of the cervical arch or even turning the wrong way can cause misalignment and pinched nerves and damage. Then compare your neck muscles. Take the biggest bodybuilder powerlifter you know. Get them to squeeze their neck as hard as they can, and then get them to squeeze their arm as hard as they can. The density and the coverage and the amount of mass on an average arm compared to an average neck, again, is incomparable. If I take my arm like this and go as tensely as I can, and you hit it with light to moderate power, you'll be able to feel my humeral bone right through the mass. If by comparison I have somebody contract their neck as hard as possible and I poke with my fingers, with very little power, I can usually feel the density of your bone. And anytime we're affecting nerves or vessels, it's basically like a blacksmith. I want to have a good anvil on which to put that target so that when I hit it, it's reinforced, it's cemented in place. If a blacksmith was trying to hammer out a horseshoe on sand or on mud, it would be very difficult because it would always be moving. It needs to be on a solid surface. Likewise, if I hit a nerve that's free-floating and mobile, it's harder to affect it. But if I hit that nerve, in this case to a 45-degree angle back towards the spine, there's going to be huge affectation because the nerve has nowhere to go, the vessel has nowhere to go, the artery has nowhere to go in some cases. So fundamentally what we're looking to do is we're looking in application to strike on the facet, on the angle of the neck, striking it backwards into the spine. So it can work frontally with this type of a push. When we talk about compounding later on, compounding at that point of impact is a very helpful way to do it. Likewise, if I'm coming from behind, we're looking at a strike usually that's going to wrap around. And so I can use the mass of my forearm to come in like this and the fist wrapping around, and I'm likely again to get that angle on the side here. Strikes to the back, to that sort of turtle shell of the sternocleidomastoid, can still affect the nerves, can still affect the arteries, and to some extent it can also still affect the carotid sinus, but it has a lot more mass and stability to go through. So it's a little bit tougher. If I was coming from behind and I was looking at sort of a less responsible strike, if I had to knock somebody out at any cost, but the person was too high for me to reach over easily, I would far rather just hammer fist into the brainstem. That's going to be a much faster knockout. Or palm strike, like a volleyball serve, smash right down into the base of the skull. That's a far faster knockout, but one that is somewhat less responsible. What's important to understand is that we're affecting deep levels of physiology here, and these can have lasting damaging effects on the human. There is really no argument for demoing this either than to feed your own ego. If someone feels the comparative density between their arm and the bone solidity there to the density of their neck and has doubt that getting chopped to the neck would cause damage or doesn't believe it would expressly knock someone out, there's enough video already on the net and there's enough medical evidence to comprehensively prove this. Hitting them is only an indulgence of your ego. It's not proving anything. And we should never teach in this way where we have to break somebody in order to prove it. Moreover, the effects can be long-lasting. It can cause chronic neck pain and injuries and circulatory impingement. So I cannot caution enough against doing this type of work. And again, I say it from experience. One of my first systems was heavily based on pressure points and vital points. I was taught this. I was hit this way many times. People around me were hit this way many times. I was guilty of doing it in my own teaching in the mid to late 90s. I regret it. It was part of my learning curve. I would never do it again. And so I just strongly encourage you, especially the younger, more keen instructors out there that learn this. Sometimes it does seem somewhat magical. This is one of those strikes that's about as close to the dim-mak death touch one-point knockout that we'll ever get. And so it's very, very tempting and attractive to hit it. But what ultimately matters for me is the delivery mechanism. What we can train safely is the ability to get these arms up in a fast and reliable manner under stress. Simply walking up and smashing somebody in certain points when they're prone proves nothing and actually has very little application in the real world. The only thing that does translate is delivery system. The ability to reliably bring your tool to target under stress in the highest states of resistance and mobility. So this is what we should be looking for in the delivery of the bridge arm, not the actual application of force and the creation of a knockout in training.